CSS transforms provide us with simple ways to move, rotate, scale, and skew elements in two-dimensional or three-dimensional space. Like transitions, 2D transforms have excellent support in today's modern browsers, including IE9 and up. So let's take a closer look at how they work. In our HTML file, we have an image of Mike the Frog, and it's wrapped in a div with the class box. In our CSS, I've created a few styles for our box div, including a lighter background image of Mike that we'll see shortly, so that we can see the transformations we apply to this embedded image of Mike in relation to its original position on the page. And I'm using Chrome, so I'll be including the WebKit vendor prefix in the transformation properties we'll be covering. Firefox does support transitions unprefixed, but I find that currently they're slightly better in Chrome, so I'll be using it in this example. So the transform property can accept as many functions as needed, but we'll go over a few of them individually first. So in our Mike rule, we'll type WebKit transform. Now first up, let's add a rotation to our Mike image. For this, we will use the rotate function, which accepts arguments in various types of angle units. The degree or deg unit, for example, moves the element in a circular motion up to 360 degrees. For example, if we specify a rotation of 45 degrees and refresh it in the browser, we can see that because we defined a positive value, the image is rotated clockwise 45 degrees from its original position. And a negative value moves it 45 degrees counterclockwise from its original position. We can also use other alternative units, for example, the gradient or grad. So 400 grad is equivalent to one full circle or rotation. So this is equivalent to 360 degrees. And 200 grad is then equivalent to 180 degrees or a half rotation, and so forth. We can also use radians or rad. So 1 rad is equal to about 57 degrees. The value 3.14, commonly known as the mathematical constant pi, is equal to 180 degrees. So there's our half rotation. And one full circle is 2 pi radians, which approximates to 6.28. So this is equivalent to a full circle or 360 degrees. Grads and rads are a little more complex for determining rotation angles, as we just saw. For a more intuitive angle unit, we can use the turn unit. So this is one of the most intuitive to use because we define exactly what we want. For example, 1 turn is a full rotation. Then 0.5 turn is a half rotation, or 180 degrees. And then 2 turns will give us 2 rotations, and so forth. Now, let's take these transforms a step further and combine them with a transition, because that's what makes our transforms really exciting. In our CSS, we'll create a new rule using the hover pseudo class on our wrap selector. So whenever we hover over the wrap element, it will trigger the transitions and transforms on the Mike image. But first, in our Mike rule, we'll need to define a transition. So we will go ahead and make it a 1 second duration, and we will set the timing function to ease in, out. Next, I'll just need to copy the new transform we created into the hover rule. And we'll save this. And when we refresh and hover over wrap, there's our transform with the transition applied. So it's a little more interesting now that it's animated this way. We can also define the origin of our transform with the transform origin property. So in our hover rule, we will add WebKit transform origin. The default value for transform origin is 50%, 50%, which places the origin in the center of the element. So when we apply a rotation to an element, it rotates around the center origin, like our mic image is doing now. But we can change the origin by specifying a different origin value. For example, 100% and 100% will change the x and y origins. So the first value is for x, and the second is for y. So this will position the origin 100% to the right and 100% down. And as you can see in our graphic here, the actual origin is the bottom right corner of the box. So now when we refresh, we can see the graphic rotate from the bottom right corner, and the transformation behaves differently. The image swings around to its end position. We can also use position keywords like top, right, bottom, or left. So here I'll just define it as top, right, which positions the origin in the top right corner. So there's what that looks like. Next, we can increase or decrease the size of elements using the scale function. So scale x will scale our image horizontally on the x-axis. So let's give it the value 1.5, and we'll save this. So now the image is stretched and scaled 1.5 times, or 150% its original size on the x-axis. The same happens with scale y, except that the scaling affects the y-axis. So now we can see that it's stretched vertically. To scale both x and y at the same time, we can simply use scale, which accepts one argument that will affect x and y. So now we can see that our image is scaled evenly on the x and y axis. There's also a function for skewing elements. So the skew function gives it a slanted or twisted appearance. For example, the skew x property skews it on the x-axis. So let's go ahead and give it a value of 45 degrees. So we can see how the image is skewed 45 degrees from its original position on the x-axis. Now a negative value will then skew it 45 degrees the opposite way. Skew y works the same way, except that it skews it on the y-axis. So next up, with the translate property, we can move elements around on the page. Now, the translate function accepts any length unit or percentage in its argument. So translate x, for example, will move the image left to right on the x-axis from its original position. So let's go ahead and specify an argument of 200 pixels, and we'll save this. So now we see the image move 200 pixels to the right from its original position on the page. And a negative value will then move the image 200 pixels in the opposite direction. Now, when using percentages, for example, the value 100% moves it by 100% of the element size. So our image is currently 150 pixels wide. So the function is moving it 150 pixels from its original position. So if the image was 300 pixels wide, it would move it by 300 pixels and so forth. The same thing happens with translate Y, but this time the image moves on the y-axis. So the value 100% moves it down based on the element's height. So here it's moving down by about 165 pixels. And if we give it a negative value, it then moves up from its original position. To simultaneously declare both X and Y translations, we can use the translate function. So this is the shorthand for translate X and translate Y. So in our argument, we'll need to define two values, one for X and one for Y. So X will be 300 pixels and Y will be 100 pixels. If we don't include a second value, it's assumed to be 0. So we'll save this, and when we refresh, we can see how it moves 300 pixels horizontally on the x-axis and 100 pixels vertically on the y-axis. Pretty cool. Now with percentages, we can go ahead and define negative 200% for X and 80% for Y. So now it moves left on the x-axis by 200% and down on the y-axis by 80%. So this is similar to using the top, left, bottom, and right positioning offsets, but the translate method is actually much better performance-wise because any 2D or 3D transforms happen on the GPU. They're hardware accelerated, which results in smoother animations, so they're not as choppy because the browser gives us quick frame rates. So consider this method first before using the positioning offsets to move elements around the page. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we can combine any of the transform functions and use as many as we want to create all sorts of effects. So for example, let's combine scale and rotate. So we will scale it by 1.5, then give it a rotation of 25 degrees. So we'll save this. And there we see how it scales and rotates at the same time. So let's go ahead and add the translate function and give it an X position of 50% and a Y of negative 25%. So now it also moves while it scales and rotates. But let's go ahead and rotate it a full circle while moving it to the right 50%. So we will change this to 360 degrees, and we will give it the translate X function, where we will translate it by 50%. And there you go. Finally, we'll need to add the vendor prefixed properties for Safari, IE9, and the older versions of Firefox and Opera.